government is that it plays a lot of really important roles. I mean, the military is one, police, fire, public safety, EMTs, schools, food safety. You know, there's so many things, air traffic control. I mean, you can go down the list of all the things the government does that are really important that we just take for granted because they're there. We figure, oh, well, that's just there. That's part of the natural order of things, but it's not. What I look towards is the fact that there are things that we need our government to do that it is not doing. And when I talk about the issue of the hospital consolidation, and I keep talking about this because it is the #1 largest expense that people face is your health insurance costs. And our government's failure to break up those kinds of monopolies or change the economic model so they can't profiteer at everybody's expense. That's a failure of government. And it is not a truth that letting those hospitals continue to do what they do is in everybody's best interests. There are people who will tell you it. There were people from those hospitals that will say, you know what, the bigger we get, the more efficient we become. Now, I've got Verizon, and I don't have the choice of switching to Comcast. I'm not sure that I would. I know that companies like the cable companies will tell you, it's better when we're bigger. You don't need choice. Choice? Come on, don't choose. You don't need to, it's so confusing. Comcast and Verizon, the channels will change. You don't need that. It was, you know, Fox used to be 625 and now it's 803. How are you going to live in that world? So they want to keep you away from choice. But this is how monopolies work. And they work closely, hand in glove with the government, always. This is our history. This is the reality. So government has a really important role to play to make sure that that playing field stays level. Nature does not lead to level playing fields. Bottom line, that's what we've seen in capitalist economies. And I'm a capitalist. I got a nice suit on. I'm a capitalist. You know Howie Carr? You know the guy. So he called me a communist, or he called me Comrade Falchuk. Do I sound like a communist to you?
No.
It's awesome, and you guys are the Tea Party. Thank you. Mark didn't answer. He said, "Well."
All right. After the next question, we're going to open up for questions from the audience for a moment. Before I give you number 5, I just want to mention something. The Unemployment Prevention Agency, the EPA, and the Department of Transportation have been directed by the guy in the White House to do a lot of things that hurt every one of us in this room when it comes to energy costs. And just because of my background, I happen to know a lot about this. So I'm going to preface this question with a little bit of background for you. You know, there's a proposed pipeline to go from New York to Drake. We all know that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you understand what the problem is that there's no pipeline from New York to Drake? Okay. Let me explain it to you real quickly. The pipe starts out in the western part of the country at a 3-foot inside diameter. When it gets to Selkirk, New York, it's 6 inches. Okay? Now, what do if it doesn't go any further than Selkirk, New York? And you need energy here in New England. By the way, that is liquid propane, liquid gas, gaseous gas, meaning, you know, they haven't converted it, oil, heating oil. Gasoline's a little bit different. You have to get trucks, and you have to drive to Selkirk, New York, and you have to fill it up, and you have to drive it back to New Bedford, Fall River, Providence, Manchester, Boston, and a few other places, and then it goes to distributors and wholesalers, and then it comes to us. You may not know that this president decided, through regulating the trucking industry, and he looked at several specific regions, us being one of them, that limited the number of hours that a tractor-trailer driver can drive, and they've cut those back dramatically over the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, it's about half what they legally used to be able to drive. So no longer, if you remember last January, how all of a sudden our heating oil and our gas went way up? Okay. Well, that's at the peak, right? Naturally. The problem is, it became a 2-day drive from up here to go to Selkirk, New York, to get that truck, fill it up, and come back, adverse to a 1-day drive. That doubled your transportation costs in labor in man hours, the total man hours that it takes to move it, okay? It didn't double the fuel to move it, but it almost doubled everything. Congress even woke up and realized that there was a mistake there. So they gave a wintertime exemption for hauling fuels, and they passed that on January 21, almost unanimously. Does anybody know when the guy in the White House signed the bill?
December 31st.
It was at the end of April. Spring's here. Okay?
And everybody here put him in office.
So, the reason I'm bringing this up is, I understand that there are issues. Several people were talking about this as people came in, about eminent domain and pipelines and things like that. Some people environmentally concerned. Well, I grew up in oil country in Pennsylvania. I grew up in coal country. I know an awful lot about this. First of all, pipelines today are not made out of steel pipes that rot out. And it is interesting, by the way, that the ones that we get water from the Quabbard and the here are about 150 years old, and they were designed to be 75. That's not to say that there can't be an accident. Of course there can. There can be any kind of accident, okay? But today they use products to run the oil and the gas, all that through, that aren't affected by weather, and they're not going to corrode. And they're double sleeved. So it's basically, there's a pipe inside a pipe. So if the pipe carrying the product does break, it goes to the exterior pipe and it's contained. Okay, that being said, gentlemen, this pipeline that's proposed from Selkirk, New York to Drake it is going to create some jobs. Some of it's going to get exported. Most of it's going to stay here. They don't talk about that. How do you guys feel about this pipeline? And how do you feel about the people who say, well, not in my land and we can't do it? And in those specific towns, I can't say that word, who voted against it, it hurts everybody in the rest of New England. Now, that kind of gets a little touchy there, but people need to look at it in that context. Mark?
Actually, I'm for it. It's funny, a part of government is trying to make decisions with regard to the common good, common welfare. And as President Lincoln reminded us, you can't please all the people all the time. There are some people that are going to be adversely affected by this. A quick story, in my neighborhood, we have a cul-de-sac. And in the middle of the cul-de-sac, there's this green area, there's some trees. And my next door neighbor, out of the goodness of his heart, has mowed that lawn and fertilized it and weeded it, and all at his own expense. And a couple of years ago, he put something out on the neighborhood Facebook page that, hey, can you guys chip in a few bucks for me? Sounds reasonable, right? So there was a vote taken. Should we get a landscaper to take care of it? Should we pay this guy a few bucks every month to take care of it? And there was a vote taken, blah, blah, blah. The majority wanted to pay him some money each and every month. And a woman who voted against paying him something every month complained. Well, doesn't my vote count? Yes, your vote counted, and you lost. I'm sorry. It's a democracy. The majority rules. Somebody's not going to be happy. Somebody's not going to be happy. So I'm for it, and I do understand that it's going to impact. My uncle has on his property the existing pipeline that comes up from Tennessee goes through his property. It's been there for years, but yeah, I wouldn't like it in my backyard. I don't think anybody here would like it in their backyard. It's part of the sacrifice that individuals have to make for the common good.
Evan?
Well, I've been against it, but I'll tell you why. Mark told you why too, so I'm not implying that you didn't. The company that's behind this pipeline, Kinder Morgan, is working with the federal regulatory agency that's going to be doing the eminent domain, FERC. And these guys have the power to take the land. And the way that many of the people who live along that pipeline route found out about the pipeline was by having someone survey their property. Sometimes it was just by getting one of those door hangers that said, hey, there might be someone on your property, sign this release so that in case anybody gets injured, we're responsible for the injury. And of course that led the property owner to say, surveying my property for what? And that led to finding out about the pipeline. Now in the cities and towns, the story I heard over and over again was a landowner going to their town, their selectmen or aldermen, whatever they might have in that community, and saying, what's going on? And the selectman saying, I haven't the slightest idea what's going on. And they start bringing it up the pipeline. Well, I mean, no pun intended. But I really didn't mean that. That was just, that came out. What ended up happening is you find out that there were plenty of people in the federal government knew all about the desire to build this pipeline, but no one in the local communities did. And there was never this conversation to say, what is in the best interest of the people of Massachusetts? It was never a topic of discussion. There was not a vote. There was not an open hearing process. They tried to do it after the fact of the cities and towns. But it was a complete running roughshod over the concept of self-government, over the concept of home rule, over the concept of local control, all at the behest of a large politically connected company. Now let me tell you one other thing about this. There was a study that was done by a consultant called Black & Veatch, you can read this, that looked at the need for this pipeline, the need for it. And the basis on which they were analyzing this was the need for more natural gas capacity here in Massachusetts. And they set out 3 scenarios: high demand, low demand, or high, middle, and low. And the low scenario was one in which we implemented conservation efforts, where there was more efficiency, where there was more use of solar and wind, which were things that were going on. They decided to use the high demand scenario for their model, and that was the one in which the only sensible choice was to build this additional pipeline. Again, without any public hearing, without any public debate on this issue, the company decided and the regulators decided this was the direction we needed to go. So I'm against it, both because I don't believe that there's the need, just based on reading the report that the company itself put out, and because I don't like the fact that our government is not accountable to us, and that behind our backs it's deciding to do this again at the behest of a large politically connected company. If you hear me telling the same kind of story over and over again, it's because that's what's happening in our country. We're being deceived when people try to distract us by having other debates while this kind of nonsense goes on.
You know, unfortunately, one of the solutions to this would have been to allow large ships to come into Boston with gas and oil. Of course, not in my backyard. And you may not know this, but when the Big Dig was orchestrated, the tunnel was built 40 feet higher than it was originally planned. Now, there's 2 issues with that. One, they weren't down in solid earth, they were in muck. And of course, remember that whole story about how they had to freeze the ground? I know a very high-tech engineer who worked on that project, and he quit as soon as they did that. And he said, because I'm not sticking around with the lawsuits, because when you stop freezing the ground, it's going to leak. And it does. But the big factor here is, by having the tunnel 40 feet higher than it could have been, it stops these ships from coming into Boston because it's not safe for them to pass over the tunnel. Isn't that interesting? You probably hadn't heard that one before. Okay, we're going to take some, first thing Lee asked, should we all take, you want to take a break?
Yes.
Okay, well, let's do this. Let's have the commercials, and then we'll take a 10-minute break if that's, guys. Is that all right? I mean, not the commercials. That's me being on the radio. I'm sorry. It's kind of the same thing. Yes, Matt sells paint. There's the commercial. Okay. This gentleman over here has had his hand up several times. Do you want to ask a couple questions, sir?
Yeah, I have a question. Talk about paying for the government you want, right? Are you aware that your town educates 600 kids in the school system who don't live in Newton, and it costs nearly $8.5 million a year? I want to know what your opinion is on that.
So we're continuing.
No, we'll do the questions, and then after the questions, we'll take the break. But go ahead, go take, answer the question.
I mean, I'm not specifically aware of those numbers. You're talking about Metco students?
Medco, staff kids, Edco,
Yeah.
and some others. I mean, there's 600 kids in the schools who don't live in Newton but attend Newton schools. That's a whole school, an entire school. Newton had to pay an $11.5 million override, Proposition 2.5 override last year. Yet we're giving away $8.5 million worth of educational services to other cities and towns. And your wife endorsed the override, as far as last I checked.
I didn't know that about my wife. She's great. I voted for it too.
It's a modern marriage.
Don't you think Boston and other communities that send Newton kids into the Newton school system they should be paying us the difference between our average cost and state aid for educating their kids in our school system.
No, it's a fair question. So let me say two things about this. One of them is that the way in which the state pays cities and towns, there's a law called Chapter 70, which is woefully out of date. Woefully out of date. It does not reflect the realities of educating kids in now, the second decade of the 21st century. It was a formula created in the early 90s. It was a good idea. It was meant to reduce the disparities in funding, because cities like Newton, we've got resources that other communities do not. So we should take less from the state than the communities that need more. That's appropriate. But they haven't updated the formula, which again is the same story again about cities and towns not getting the aid that they need. That needs to be updated so that cities and towns are getting that money. To the second point though, which has to do with educating kids from other communities, I support the METCO program. I think it's important. The people of Newton, we had a very transparent, open discussion about these issues. My kids, I got 3 of them in the Newton Public Schools, and we had a vote on the override, and the override passed, and it was a hard-fought battle. Well, what I found most interesting about it was that at the elementary school where my youngest goes, and I give them credit, there were people from the school committee and a couple people from the Board of Aldermen came to talk about this to a packed room of parents. Every one of whom I think was voting for the override because we were all parents of kids in that elementary school and we needed a modular classroom built, 2 of them actually, for that school. And they were very skeptical. And the things they were asking the people on the Board of Aldermen was, how do we know you need the money that you say you need? How do we know you're not coming back next year for another override, right? How do we know this money's not going to get diverted for other causes? And I found that to be a very fascinating thing. From an audience that was friendly to the overall cause, they didn't trust that the money was going to get spent in the right way. Now, I think it's good that there were that many people there. I think that's great civic engagement. I think we need to see more of that. But once again, once you have the vote, we move forward. We move forward.
But I'm saying for like, in the future, don't you think Boston and other communities should be sending Newton an $8.5 million check for educating their kids in the Newton public school system?
I just don't know how that works exactly. Otherwise, I would tell you what I thought. I just don't know how that works. So,
Newton spends about $17,000 per kid to educate them in the school system. And then they get a couple $1 million of grants from the state for the METCO grant.
Right.
And you got an $8.5 million net cost. Who should be paying that? Should Boston and other communities be paying that, or should Newton taxpayers be paying that?
yeah, again, I don't know how the specifics of that work.
Well, basically, I think there's something that we can just wrap that question up for a moment. I'm going to go back to what Mark said about New Bedford. I think one of the major problems that we've run into in education here is the cost and how it's hurt the family unit of taking kids out of their neighborhood. Why don't we concentrate on neighborhoods and make the schools better in the neighborhoods where the parents can watch their kids and they know what's going on? But unfortunately, that isn't the way it happened, and it happened all across the country. Mark, do you have any comments? You're all set? Okay. Alex, you had a quick question, and then we'll
Oh, well, let's take a break.
Okay, let's take a break, just about, 5 to 10 minutes, so please come right back.